this is a conversation I've been looking forward to having. And I think this will be a series of conversations. I think Ken and myself could spend a good 3 to 33 hours talking about what makes people tick. Clay and I have actually enjoyed lots of parallel conversations talking about the human body and human psychology, like how the brain and the body work together, and the corollaries between physical therapy and even psychotherapy. So when you're leading, um, I think we would probably say that most of the conversations we have with leaders about their businesses revolve around people. And so in some respect, we become scientific almost. We talk about becoming psychologists. We're a little bit of a warrior poet. We go into the field of battle, so to speak, to pursue our mission, but that requires a team, that requires people in the right place at the right time, carrying the right instruments, the right tools, the right weapons. So we really have found a lot of joy and taken a lot of delight in helping leaders better understand themselves, because first and foremost, I've got to be able to connect with myself and understand myself in order to better connect with other people. So then we can lead and grow an organization or attack a mission as a community, common unity. So it's the unification of individuals who come together because of something they believe in and are willing to work toward and even make sacrifices for. So the power of you and I continually being a student of understanding ourselves and understanding people cannot be overstated. So I'll introduce this just through my own personal experience and how I got introduced to this, which some of you have heard me tell this story now, and I've told this story a lot more since Ken and I have started doing all this work together. But it was about 2006 or 2007, and I had been working in our family business at Memphis Communications Corporation. I was the youngest of 8. My 4 older brothers and my dad were all involved in the business, as well as some other, it's about 100 employees, debt-free company, 150-mile radius coverage of the city of Memphis for office automation and communication. And I'd worked there all my life in some capacity, whether it was in the stock room or whether it was in, just helping maintenance around the building, and then in sales and selling supplies, and then ultimately selling equipment, and ultimately running a division of the company. And in about a 6-7 year period, found myself, in simple terms, I would say lost. I was working so compulsively, and I really did not know who I was, for lack of a better phrase. I didn't know what I wanted, what I cared about, what energized me. Everything just required me to hit the gas. I was like, just hit the gas, keep going, don't slow down. There's no time to stop. You just have to keep going. And I hit a type of a wall. I call it kind of an early midlife crisis. And I'd already had a relationship with Ken and knew a little bit about what he did. And I trusted him enough to be one of the first people that I told that I really didn't know what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go next. And so Ken graciously mentored me at that point. And one of the things that he introduced me to were these psychometric instruments. I had no exposure to anything like that at the time. Since then, have had exposure to tons of different tools and resources, largely through my relationship with Ken. But that was the first time, and I vividly remember you were on 1,000 Oaks back in the day when I first met Ken with you to talk through some of those early assessments, if I remember correctly. And I remember the feeling of feeling seen and actually seeing myself on paper in a way that felt incredibly empowering. It gave me a perspective and a bit of an acceptance, and even to the point of like a kind of liking myself, like being able to look at how I was wired and liking what I saw and wanting to cooperate with that person more. So I've kind of started to refer to these tools as MRI, like emotional relational MRIs, because they give you a resolution, like a higher resolution picture into yourself and into others. Now, I don't want this conversation really to be a commercial for any one assessment. That's not the goal. I think the goal that we have for the conversation today is to help encourage you from a leadership perspective that there is a reliable science to understanding people. We have tools that are highly validated that can be trusted as you hire, develop, promote, deploy, organize individuals into teams and communities for a bigger purpose and mission. And so that's really what I want us to, in this series of conversations, I want this to be a place where you can continue to get deeper education and a deeper working knowledge of what those reliable measurements are, beyond, way beyond what is popularized today. And we don't beat up on any assessment or tool, but there are differences that you need to understand. So we want to go way deeper than kind of the popular level understanding of some of the basic tests and assessments that are out there. They're fun and enjoyable and good conversation starters. When it comes to actually building a significant team, making big investments in who you hire, train, develop, you're going to need something there are things and knowledge available to you that can take you even deeper. So my experience, that was a trajectory shift for me that began a process of moving me in a different direction as it related to knowing myself. And there's a lot more to that story. Some of y'all know that came in the following years, but so that's how I got introduced to it. Ken's background with this is far more extensive. So Ken, talk a little bit about how you got into this and how this became so important to the work you do in terms of understanding traits and personalities and the work around that.
Well, the story of how I engaged these was out of necessity, really. My personality is that of a teacher. I have it all through my family, my kids, all my grandparents, aunts and uncles. There's just a lot of teachers in our family, and I think that's largely my personality. But that's not, and my mission in life now is that, but it wasn't always that. As I got into the business world, and eventually, for most of you, you've experienced this, you've evolved into the next version of who you are, and that's good. You progress. Many of you on this call that I recognize have arrived at a level of responsibility that is almost autonomous. You operate almost entirely as you desire to operate with certain constraints. We all do. And I found myself there at a very early age. I was very, very fortunate and ended up in business for myself with partners, but I was responsible for the direction of the business and the operation of the business. And we happened to, and partly by design, partly by luck, in the 80s, when the real estate markets began to turn, we found ourselves in the middle of just an incredible market for a multifamily real estate. Now, this is not a lesson on multifamily real estate, just to give you a framework of where we started. We began operating, buying, managing, renovating apartments around the country, and it grew rapidly from a small 6-person operation in a matter of less than 10 years of 2,800 people at its peak in 14 locations. And I could not keep up. I was the HR department. I was the CEO. I was the chief bottle washer. As this thing grew, I continued to want to be involved in that HR function. As I always say, if you remove people from every business issue, I would be out of business. Well, Shad and I'd be out of business because basically there's cash and there's people. That's what you deal with in business. You're dealing with one or the other all the time. I either got cash issues or I got people issues, and you take away those two things. But people were fascinating to me. They just were. But as we grew so rapidly, I began to see, and literally back in the 80s, before HR became what it is today, they just stacked these files up on my desk of people we were hiring or interviewing, and the stack would just get, and if I traveled, which I did a lot, the stacks would get higher and higher. But I wanted to look at them. I want to know where they came from. I wanted to understand them. I wanted to know, and I wanted to make sure that we understood who was coming onto our team. So many things are affected by who you let in. You think of churches and country clubs and any kind of organization, there are barriers to entry. And we didn't have any. The threshold for getting in is the old military threshold, as they say, if you can hear thunder and see lightning, you're qualified. And to some degree, I felt that's what we were doing. And of course, we were decentralized with controls. We had people everywhere. And I just could see the chaos that was going to create. And I'm literally just people coming all the time. And I wanted to build culture. I'd been conditioned to do that. But people were so critical of that. Just to give you that background. So I became interested in what I couldn't know or didn't have the ability to know, which was, if I'm going to bring someone or invite someone into our organization, why does it take us 2 years or 3 years to figure this person out? Why is it that we have to wait? And typically in those 2 years, we would come to one of 3 conclusions. And 2 years is not magical. We could get there a little sooner, but sometimes it take a little longer. But generally within 2 years, we would figure out that this person wasn't a fit. They weren't a fit because they fired us, they left. We don't like it here. We didn't feel like this was the right place for whatever reason. It was usually a small percentage of those people that did that. Occasionally, yeah, we would find somebody that was just a bad fit and we would have to terminate our relationship, but that was not a huge number of the people. Now, keep in mind, these people were cascading in here. So at the end of 2 years, the most common response I would get from one of our leaders, one of our managers, was, so-and-so is still here. But had I known 2 years ago when I hired them this issue or this situation, I might not have, or I might have gone at it a little differently. So it just piqued my curiosity. What can we know and when can we know it as early as we can know it? Now, keep in mind that human beings cannot be put in a box. You can never know everything. There's always that unknown. It can be a situation that occurs in a perfectly good environment with a perfectly capable employee where an old habit pops up or an issue in the family pops up, a divorce, a sick child, a spouse becomes ill. There are a lot of those issues, but again, that's a small percentage of problems. The biggest challenge I was seeing was we had people coming on board and it took us 2 years to figure them out, really. Now, that doesn't forego the importance of interviews and background checks. You must do those. And I say that every time I get into this conversation. I am not discouraging. In fact, I'm encouraging greatly the idea that you get good at interviewing, you get good at background checks. You need to do social media background check. There's so much information out there that you need to know and you need to understand. You need to ask good questions because your intuition is a large part of what got you where you are. You have an intuition. It's use it. Make sure it comes into play. The problem with interviewing and behavioral interviewing and intuition is that when it doesn't work, you don't know why it didn't work. Intuition is also, while it's a valuable interviewing skill, other people don't trust it. You can walk in and say, I just have this intuition that Ken's the right guy. And your people are going to say, well, okay. But they don't trust it. And by the way, you can't teach intuition. So while it's valuable, interviewing skills are valuable. And we actually wrote a 12-step process for interviewing background checks, how to do better background checks. People get discouraged doing background checks. We can talk about that at another time, what the hiring process ought to look like. But when it comes to understanding those people that I did not understand, I began to search for ways to do that. Now, back then, we didn't have Google. We didn't have an internet that was, you just didn't have those tools. Now, I'm not, by the way, we were not in horse and buggies back in the 80s, contrary to what
I was going to say, we're talking about the 1920s.
Yeah, we were in the 80s.
A little bit before electricity.
I understand. I see John Q there. He understands what the 80s were like. But we did have some tools. Well, somewhere along the way, in one of my peer groups, by the way, for all of you, peer groups are important. Whatever peer group you're a part of, they're important. You just like kids ought to have a camp experience, leaders ought to have a peer group experience. One of my peer groups suggested to me that we start assessing people. I didn't know what that meant. Long story short, I began to research that and had it researched. Our first attempt was we hired a psychologist in Colorado to start to do some work for us. Can you put an assessment together? We'll talk about local validation and what assessments for your company looks like as opposed to a general assessment. But put assessments together, and one thing led to another, and we began to build this idea that we could do assessments, that we could understand people. I would tell you today, what we knew then wouldn't even fill a 5-minute conversation compared to what we feel like we know today. But a lot of that is the result of the assessments themselves getting better and better and better, and the work through computers and psychometric measuring and artificial intelligence have made the documents that are out there very, very valuable. Now, the key is understanding the documents you're using, the assessments you're using, understand what they're designed to measure, and having someone who's qualified to interpret them. I would suggest to you, if you're an employer of over 150 people, you ought to have someone on your staff that does this. It's worth the time, the effort, the money. If you're under 150, then have someone like us do it. It's more efficient and cheaper and all of that, but do it. Assessments allow you what I call that 30% that you cannot know about a human being. Assessments put together in the right way, understood and interpreted correctly, gives you an idea of what that individual has the capacity to do and do at a high level. If you're hiring someone that you want to be very engaging, very people-oriented, and you interview me and you say, look, this job is all about people, I'm going to tell you whatever you want me to tell you and about my people skills, because I'm like you. I know how to do an interview. I know how to answer questions in an interview if I'm the prospective employee. I'm really good with people. I'm really good with people. Well, what kind of people? When are you good with them? And what is the level in which you have energy to do it? And that's the word we'll use throughout this conversation, is what energy level do you have for certain things? Now, let me pause here and turn it back to Shad, because that's my story of how I got started. Well, once we sold the company in 96, we were well into assessments. You couldn't enter our company without it. And we had a variety of assessments we did. And that's another conversation, is which ones do we need to use? Because one assessment will not, regardless of what the assessment folks tell you, there's never been one assessment that'll tell you everything you need to know about an individual that you want to know, that you can know. It's a combination of putting some together. It's just like going to the doctor and him saying, or her saying, I've got one medicine that will solve all your issues. It's never that way. Dr. Jones can tell you it's never one treatment. You've got to do a number of things to get at it. So putting the right ones together, we sold the company. I stayed on as chairman for a number of years. And the call to begin to help mid-market companies. was overwhelming to me. That's where the teacher came out, and I wanted to teach what we had done, and I was being asked to do it. So it wasn't something that I thought of myself. It kind of came to us by request. And so for the last 22 years, we've been building this advisory service to help mid-market companies. And the reason we specifically to say mid-market companies, you can define mid-market companies as $1 billion down, privately held, 500 or less employees, however you want to do that. But it's the type of companies that are on this lab. If you are doing those, you're in the minority if you're using assessments. I read recently 70% of the enterprise companies are using assessments. If you've ever applied to a large enterprise company and they had you do something on the front end and they never heard back from them, you just didn't fit their model. They have a model. It's called validation, local validation. They have a model that says, if you're coming to work for ABC company, you have to hit these measures. And if you don't, we're not even going to waste our time with you. Mid-market companies, less than 10% of those companies are using any valid form of assessments to promote their people, to change their position, to move them to new jobs, or to hire. So there's a huge gap there. So we're promoting assessments a lot. So that's how I got into it. It's a long story, but it's one that I just can't overemphasize the importance. So I know you want to get into some of the more technical and scientific aspects of assessment. So I'll fire away.
Yeah. And if you guys have questions too, feel free to chat, post in the chat. Luke will be monitoring that, but we may have some time to field some of those. And again, this will be the introduction of a multi-part conversation. But what we're, so when I started, when you start looking at personalities and you start looking at any tool out there that measures, a psychometric is just simply a way to assign value to a particular trait or psychological behavior of an individual. And it's lexical, like it's based on our vocabulary, assuming that the vocabulary we have is sufficient enough to describe those traits. And if you start doing into that work and you keep backing up and digging one layer deeper, at least from my perspective, you end up kind of coming to some level of bedrock with what's known as the Big Five. And you may or may not have heard this, but the Big Five is kind of a gold standard of sorts, where it's a categorization of or factors of common traits and how those traits fit into each one of those factors, like extroversion, openness to new experiences, what was called neuroticism, conscientiousness. And so those factors, within those factors are a multitude of traits. And so when we're using a tool that we just call an assessment, and there are certain tools that can be used for measuring culture, can be used for measuring, certainly for personalities, can be used for measuring. And here's what's super important when you're using something, and Ken said this earlier, of we're not using valid sources for some of this information, which I'll let Ken talk about validation in a second. But you're using tools that are repeatable, meaning if you did these over and over again, that you would get similar, consistent results. That they are validated, meaning that they have been scientifically proven to measure what they say they measure. They also are predictive, meaning that they have some functional value, that there's something that is of utility within the assessment itself. So it allows you to make better decisions about what it is you're trying to do with the individual cultural organization. So really important that, and then the other component is the benchmarking. What are we comparing it to? What's the baseline? So Ken, elaborate on the kind of some of the finer elements of those, that what makes it valid, and kind of what do we start to look for when we are assessing an individual, and contrast that with our intuition, right? Because I think part of what we're using these assessments for is to really test our theories. Your intuition is a theory about somebody, but until you test it and research it, background checks, interviews, pre-survey interview questions, assessments, and validated tools, then you don't really know. And another, as your organization grows and scales to any degree, you can't replicate that process if it's rooted in your intuition. I love what you said earlier, Ken, is that you don't know what worked and what didn't. So you spend a lot of time guessing as opposed to learning. And what we really want to advocate for is that everything that you do in your hiring, promoting, developing, is you learn from it, and then you're able to take what you've learned and apply it back to the top of the funnel. Who am I looking for? Like what have I found, and where do I go to get more of that? So touch on, Ken, some of the validation, benchmark, some of those elements that make a tool actually useful.
For some of you that play a sport like golf, I hear this all the time. I go out and I hit a great shot, and the next one is horrible, and I can't tell the reason that I hit the good one versus the bad one. And that's what intuition does to us. We make a great decision and we applaud ourselves. We think we've got it, and then we make a bad one and we say, what happened? So I've been privileged over the years not only to be trained by some of the best minds in this whole psychometric business. Psychometric is just a term. It is a body of psychology. It's rooted in the Latin term or word of measurement and mental. But a psychometrician is a type of psychologist who measures. And I've been fortunate to work with some of the best minds in this industry and watching them, writing with them, writing. I worked with one of the great, kind of the godfather of this stuff, Dr. Pierce Howard, who's now retired, working on several documents with him. But he would take these psychometrician graduate students out of the University of North Carolina, where he was, and they would do all of these studies. And that's the term that we use. Validation comes in a lot of forms. There's face validity, which means if you read your study, you say, yeah, that looks like me. It's always amazing to me when we go through a study and look at someone and they say, that's fascinating. You just asked those few questions and you know all that about me. That's face validity. It has to be. In other words, when you see the results, you kind of say, yeah, man, that's really like me. There's actually something called faith validity, which is you trust it. That's not a very empirical way to look at it. Content, if you will, content validity or logical validity is that it covers all aspects of what you're measuring. We're measuring personality. Now, people say, well, that's just introversion or extroversion, and that's the layman's definition of personality. Personality encompasses all of the parts of you that Shad mentioned a while ago: your emotional makeup, your drive, your curiosity, your structure, your the way you go toward people, how you agree or disagree in situations, how emotional you are. So that it has to cover that. That is that content validity. In other words, when they put an assessment together, it has to measure all the things that it's supposed to measure. Empirical validation or what we call predictive validation, Shad touched on that. It's got, based on what we see with no changes, we can predict some activity. If you, and I'll use the one most people use, it's the easiest one to understand. On a scale of 0 to 100, if you benchmark, now benchmark is a group of people, in our case, thousands of, typically we'll compare in the executive world or management world, we'll use Western world, English speaking, college educated, white and gray collar jobs. It's a big benchmark. It's better than what mom tells you, but if you're a people person, and I mean, you've got this social drive, we would call you extroverted, and you would fit into that 80% and above scale. Do you know how many people fit in that scale? Less than 15% of the people. The majority of people fit in between the introverted, which is that those people who scale 1 and 2. Doesn't mean they're bad with people. It's just they just don't get much out of interacting with people. Social people can be very bad with people, but they love the energy. The majority of us are what we call ambiverts. We have a certain amount of energy for certain people at certain times. That's predictive validation. We can predict that at times you will withdraw, depending on whether you're a 4 or a 6. Won't get into all those numbers, but where you fit on the benchmark tells us when your energy for people will wane. Now we got to talk about what kind of people. What are you doing when you get drained? People are a big issue in an assessment, but it's only one issue. And then the one that I really like is the construct validity. And that's where the psychometricians tested and retested and tested and retested. It says within a very, very high percentage, and you get different definitions of what a high percentage is, but generally there'll be a 90+% construct validity. It just meets all the standards. By the way, the reason most of these big enterprise companies can use these is because they are EEOC and court tested. They're fair. They don't. They're not unfair to a certain group of people. If you're applying for this job, you should meet these standards, and you should have these certain traits that we can measure. We use in one of our primary ones, we use something that is, we call it a personality. You can do cognitive testing, which is mental ability. It's IQ, it's math, it's verbal. We can do aptitude. We do aptitude testing for entry-level, blue collar, what we call workforce jobs. But the ones we use for this group that's on this call, and generally the people you're paying the most money to, are what we call personality-based testing. Most of the tests out there are measuring basically the same types of things within a personality. They may name them something different, but typically the standard testing will test for 25 to 30 traits. And those traits will be broken up into groups like Shad said, neuroticism, agreeableness, your personality types. So we could, like Shad said, this conversation could go on and on, but validity is an important thing. The type of test you're using, the method of the testing. Most of our testing is coming through that personality inventory. It's there's all kinds of testing. Most of what we're doing now, there are some that go way back into the 20s, 1920 and earlier, but most of the testing we're doing now has been developed since the 70s and has been just continually improved and defined. So most of the work we're doing now are with assessments that have been constructed since the 70s. That's not to say that some of the older ones that go back into the 40s and the 20s, the military used to use manual assessments, but a lot of mistakes in them. They're slow to get to and you can only measure a few small things. So yeah, today it's really important to have one that you can measure, not just mechanically with a hand document, but using artificial intelligence with these with the technology that's out there.
So one thing that is really, I think, also important scientifically is when you think about distribution. So normal distribution that says like height is normally distributed, weight is normally distributed across the population. There's a bell curve, and people fit normally within that bell curve. We also we're all familiar with the 80-20 rule, right? Well, that's the Pareto distribution, meaning that 20% of your results, or 80% of your results, are going to come from 20% of the people. Creative accomplishment, performance, production, distribution of material gain, those things are not on a normative scale. And so just kind of bringing this home, and not bringing the call home, but this point home, the importance of leveraging all of these tools that are at your disposal when it comes to hiring and building your team becomes exponentially valuable if you're able to learn. So for instance, if you have a sales force, applying the Pareto distribution, the 80-20 rule, if it's a sales force of 10 people, 3 of those 10 are going to produce 80% of your results. If it's 100 people, or if it's a 1,000-person sales force, and you're going to have 10 people producing, or 30 people producing 80% of your results. So if you can identify traits that are predictive and reliable and valid and benchmarked, that fit that, in this case, a particular sales role, and obviously production is different in different roles and positions, but if you can learn, then the exponential gain that comes from that insight and that knowledge, economically, culturally, professionally, and not to mention what it does to the energy that you end up having to use to make the decisions about who to add, what, when you're guessing using your intuition, the value, the functional value, the utility of that is hard to quantify. It's hard to calculate. So I think deploying this knowledge in an objective way, in addition to your intuition and experience and your industry expertise and knowledge of the field that you're in, really gives you can give you a somewhat a superpower. And I don't think I'm exaggerating that. Ken, when we're looking at some of these, and let's just take hiring, and I want us to, can you describe how these traits, so these traits break down under these categories of personality, and we touched on extroversion or agreeableness or the nature in which I react to stress. But when we're looking at how those traits, and you said this earlier, you won't hear us talking about strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk about areas of natural high energy, areas of fade or low energy, because we're not measuring competency in a lot of these cases. We don't know how good people are going to be at certain things, or what their character is going to be like, or what their value structure is going to be like. But you can predictively gauge, will they have the energy to apply to this particular task over an extended period of time, naturally. So if you can talk about the blends or some of those traits and competencies and how that fits together, that'd be interesting.
Well, and that's the heartbeat. I think once you get past all of the validation questions, and people do tend to, I've rarely asked anyone, have you ever taken an assessment, where they don't say, yes, I have. What did you take? Don't know. What did you learn from it? Nothing. Who used it to help you? And they'd say no one. So everybody's senses, whether they did or not, they may have taken strength finders, which is not a validated, it's a marvelous marketing tool. It's a great conversation. It's a great party conversation to know what my strengths finders are, but I wish I'd been smart enough to put something out and make $1 billion off of it. But to compliments to Marcus Buckingham, who's a wonderful, wonderful teacher and researcher. But it was really a marketing ploy. In fact, it was a very successful one. But not to divert over to there, but most people don't know, even though they think they've taken one, they don't know whether it's valid. They may have taken one at church to find out what their service, what their gifts are. So they've all had some experience. And unfortunately, it probably wasn't a positive experience. If anything, it was a neutral experience. I want this to be a positive experience. So we use them for hiring, we use them for coaching, a lot of things. But at the root of it, what we're able to do is measure these traits. Traits are to a human being what an ingredient is to a chef. A trait in and of itself is not something you necessarily use. Now, I'll divert onto that in just a moment because some of them you might, like detail orientation. We can measure the degree to which you go toward details. There are 29, we measure 29 of them. And those traits are things like your creativity, energy, your structure, how emotional, how intense you are, how much you like to take ownership of things versus not, how quickly you will speak out versus never speaking out. And we have words for those. Those are called traits. The construct in these allows us to benchmark ourselves or an individual in where they fit in that benchmark. So think of yourself as a shelf, and now I've given you a certain number of ingredients on your counter, and I said, all right, I want you to make me a chocolate cake. You, as a trained chef, you would understand what to take to mix together to make a really wonderful chocolate cake. I want to hire someone, and I've got a job description. But we don't write job descriptions in terms of traits. We write them in terms of what's called competencies. A competency is a cake. I want them to be able to manage their time. I want them to be good at communicating. I want them to be ambitious and driven. Typically, a job description will have as many as 30 competencies. That's what a cake is to you and me. The cake is a competency. It's a job requirement. So you take any job. That's the reason I always like to look at the job description that you're asking us to look at, or the person's going to fill. What are you asking them to do? Now, on average, if your job description has 20 to 30 competencies, job requirements. By the way, we have a validated file of over 200 competencies. So if you really want to mess somebody up one day, write a job description with 200 competencies in it and give it to them. But we basically are doing that when we give them 30, because there's no human being that I've met, and I've done thousands of these, that has on average more energy for more than 12 of those. 9 to 10 is average, which means that if I'm going to make a chocolate cake and I'm going to make 30 of them, those are competencies, I'm only going to make 9 to 12 of them really good. there's going to be as many as 10 to 15 that are going to be not so good. And you say, well, wait a minute, I can't hire someone who's not very good at 15 of the 30 job requirements. I didn't say they weren't good at it. The measurement tells us how much energy they have toward that job. And that's a critical difference. I might not be energized to do something, but I'm young and I'm vigorous and I'm energetic and I really want to do well and I'm really driven. So I will do whatever I have to do. But over time, if I have to do too many things that drain me, over time, things that normally wouldn't bother me begin to bother me. That person who 2 years ago, they loved the opportunity to come to work for ABC company, now they're not quite so energized. And they don't recognize that the requirements are draining them. Research done several years ago said most of our employees spend 82% of their day doing things that drain them, don't energize them. Now, you can't have any of us do 100% of the day, 100% of the hour. But if I can do 30, 40% of my week in high energy work, I'm way above average. So the traits, and it takes, and this is what Shad was asking about, and he and I talk a lot about it all the time. A trait is an ingredient and a competency is a cake. But in order to get that competency, oftentimes on average, it'll take as many as 9 traits to come together. That is called a blend. In other words, if I'm going to make, let's say leadership, Psychologists have a definition of leadership. It's a little bit different than our next level definition. We've expanded it and gone deeper on it, but the basic psychological definition of leadership, they say for someone to really be energized to do this type of work, they need these 9 ingredients in this measurement. Now, you might have 6 of those in high energy and 3 that aren't. Well, you're not going to be low energy on leadership, but there are a few things in there that might slow you down. More times than not, if somebody comes to me and says, I'm really horrible on time management, we look at their 9 traits. There'll only be 2 or 3 in there that are really low energy, and we can kind of focus on those, and the whole thing moves forward. So rarely does the entire competency come in at low energy. Now, it can and it does, but typically you'll only have out of 30, you'll only have 4 or 5 that are just absolutely non-starters. They just, I don't have any energy to do that. Let's don't add that as their primary job requirement. So putting the job around people who have the energy to do it is determined by looking at their trait profile, looking at how those traits come together to match up to those job requirements. And you learn a lot. Now, let me just quickly put a disclaimer here. Culture, values, as I always say, I can't tell whether you're going to rob a bank or not, but I can tell if you're going to be good at it and whether you're going to get caught doing it. So it's really important that all these other things that we deal with are that's why we teach leadership the way we do. You cannot just deal with the person in the workplace. You've got to deal with them as a whole. So not to take away the value of putting people in the right place, but if they've got at least half the energy needed to do the job, you're going to be excited about them and they're going to be excited about you.
I think the other interesting component too on all this is the structure of the questions and the way that the questions are asked on these. The idea, so just as you are looking at how you're measuring these and how reliable and valid, how trustworthy these results are for tests that you may be using to measure these traits so that you can get these results and actually do something meaningful with them. Some of these tests use what would be called forced choice versus self-rating. So for instance, you referenced strength finders, which again, I've taken, I love, I reference, it's fun, but it's not going to be predictive in the sense that we're talking about. Those are all self-rated responses. I'm telling the test how I perceive myself, not based on a forced choice response, which is kind of where some of the AI comes into play, where it's forcing you to make certain that your responses are consistent and agree, in combination with the self-rating and being able to compare those two and blend those two in order to give you more accurate results. So that's another real important component.
Well, and let me, you're touching on probably a good place for us to bring this to a close, but in one of the most important evolutions in assessments that I have really paid attention to is what you're talking about, what we call the ipsative or forced choice questions versus normative. There are tests, there are assessments. Emotional intelligence is one where it is totally a self-rating, what we call normative. We want to know how you feel about how you're doing. And that tells a lot. And it does change depending on your circumstance. But I'll get this question all the time. Had I taken this test at 1 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock, if I'd taken it on Wednesday instead of Friday, would it be different? No. Because when the traits are, they're built in, they're hardwired, they're factory installed. When you got here, the doctor handed you to somebody and nobody knew it, but all of these traits that they now measure were there. How aggressive, how your personality, your creative energy, your structure. Now, as parents, we can make a child form into what we want them to be, but their natural bent is eventually going to break out. When we become adults, our natural style begins to develop and form more freely, more autonomously. So when we test, when we do assessments, we're looking at your self-rating, which is what we call the normative. How do you feel you are versus how in a forced choice, which is you have no idea what we're asking and why we're asking it, but it's a very validated tool. We're looking at how those match up. We want to know how well you know yourself. I did an interview last night for an organization for a senior level role, and I knew this person was highly, highly structured and organized. They were in the top 7% of the benchmark. And I just inquired, I said, when it comes to organization, structure, being organized, where would you say you are? She said, well, my family says I'm kind of overdo it. I'm kind of overly structured. And I said, why do they say that? Well, because they're not. Now, that's how we come to know ourselves. This allows us to see how you really are versus how somebody's told you you are or you think you are. When I revealed to her that she's in the top 7% of organized people on the planet, she said, wow, I should celebrate that, not apologize for it. And that's true. But whatever happens, she's always going to be organized. Her kids know it. Her family knows it. Her friends know it, but they didn't know she was more organized. They just knew they were more organized than her. So when we come to a self-rating, it's important to see what you think or what you've been told, but it's really important to see what your natural tendencies are. And then we can measure the what we call the adaptation or the gap. If you think you're this way, you're socially acceptable way. This is the way I want to be or the way I have to be to get along, but this is the way I really am. Believe me, over time, that adaptation is harder and harder to maintain. So we do look at that, and it is a major, major insight to see how much adaptation is going on in the way you work. I'm trying to be what you want me to be, but I really need to be this way to be at my best for the longest period of time.
Yeah, which also becomes a source of stress for a lot of us that we don't realize we're modulating ourselves, modifying ourselves in order to fit a particular demand or structure or construct or people pleasing. And so that can be revealed too, which is another great conversation from a coaching standpoint, where people may be experiencing some of that disconnect between how they're really wired and how they feel like they have to behave. I remember on my my assessment at one of the points on empathy, which is another trait that we can measure, especially when I got involved in a counseling center, and my adapted self was like really high empathy, but my hard wiring for empathy was pretty mid-level. But I felt this need to operate at this higher level, and I felt kind of the stress or strain of that. This is an example. So yeah, this is what I hope we can do following up this conversation is take it to the next step, which would be maybe digging into some of those competencies, some of those trait structures, because these are things you can learn to see. And become more objective in how you filter it. And this is so important. The judgments that we're making about people off the cuff are most often wrong. Our judgments about them are just not accurate, and we depend too much. We're less curious than we need to be, and we're more quick to judge than we need to be because we're trying to be efficient. And as we say, as Stephen Covey said, when it comes to people, you want to think effectiveness. When it comes to things, you think efficiency, not efficiency with people or effectiveness with things. But so the judgments we're making are generally off base. This gives you a deeper level of understanding into how people are wired and what combinations you might be seeing. not only are we looking at their nature, like how they're hardwired, we also want to look at their value structure and framework. How are they filtering what you're saying? How are we filtering and valuing? What do we value most, whether it's, utilitarianism or individuality or traditionalism, as examples, or altruism? Like, what is my primary value structure? And then, like Ken mentioned, those skill sets, which is EQI, is like these 15 different skills as to how we respond based on how we're wired and based on what we're valued, that move us into acting and behaving and relating to others in a certain way. So there's a lot available to us in our day and age when it comes to becoming a student of and really kind of a part-time psychologist, if you will, in terms of just seeking a deeper understanding of people, not only for the benefit of the organization, but maybe even more so primarily for their benefit. Because we're part of our responsibility is putting them into places where they can thrive and grow, giving them coaching that's a little bit more laser guided, as opposed to intuitive, where I sensed this, or I felt this, or I thought this, and so we end up not very much systematically moving the needle in any one particular way, because it's really more of the flavor of the day, based on how we feel about them at the time, versus
Maybe
helping
one
them.
day we can do a follow-up on career guidance, how we do that. We can talk about how any individual can become certified and begin to learn to do these. I want to make sure before we go, if anybody has a burning question, I don't want to leave people confused or at loose ends. Anybody have a burning question that we need to address?
Nothing in the chat, but y'all have any?
Okay. Good. As they always say, we've either thoroughly confused them or we've totally informed them.
Clay's got one.
All right.
My staff is small. We're in the process of hiring a new position. It's a position that it's an administrative office assistant position. So it's not like a high value. I'm not paying this person a ton of money, but being a small business, like, it really is critical every person we bring on. So do I need, I guess, just flat out, do I need to like mobilize quickly to get assessments for the people that we're hiring? Say we narrow it down to 3 people. I guess that's my question.
Do you have a job description for them?
Yes, we do. It's probably not a it's being reworked a little bit because
that's all right.
Our positions are transitioning.
But it's an administrative role. That's what you said, and it's, I got a sense in being around you what that might look like. Yeah. So any kind of one-page job description, resume, the timing is always critical for mid-market guys. I always say, let's do it late in the process. I'd rather talk you out of being in love with somebody than to spend the money on the front end like big companies have us do. They'll say, I don't even want to talk to them if you tell me they're not a fit. Well, I'm not going to tell you they're not don't hire them or hire them. I'm just going to say, this is the challenges you're faced with, or these are the opportunities. So I do it late in the process. It's a step. It is not, okay, you got to pass this, because it's not pass or fail. But answer to your question is, if you want to pick out the one person or out of the 3, the one that you really think is the one to save money, let's just do it late in the process. And if you're in love with them, think they're the perfect fit, and we come back and say this is a disaster, which we typically don't, we'll show you where the pitfalls might be, where the opportunities might be. That's the best use of the money for us in mid-market. Big companies, they'll spend a bunch of money on the front end to keep from having to even meet with them. So let's do one and see how it works. And the rest of you on the call, we can talk about something called local validation one day. That is specifically setting up, which we've done for a number of companies, an assessment for your particular company and your particular job. Most of you don't have 50 to 100 of one type of employee, which is what it takes to do a valid study, but we've done a number of them. And then we can talk about lift how much improvement you get by hiring specifically for your culture and your company. Just like in a family, not everybody fits in your family, and not everybody fits in your business. So doing a local validation, which means we are designing this assessment specifically for your company. We can talk about that at some later date. It's not important to worry about now, and we are past our time, so we need to break this off.
All right, guys. Ken, thank you. Y'all, thanks for joining. Great to see you guys. If y'all have questions or follow up, please, you know how to reach us. Shad at Edmundson.group would work great if you need to get me, but great to see y'all. Have a great rest of the week.